Dr. Ilona Jaspers is a professor at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, in the Department of Pediatrics, but she also holds joint appointments in the departments of microbiology and immunology, as well as environmental sciences and engineering. And we just finished watching your presentation, Dr. Jaspers, on e-cigarettes and vaping, health effects, misconceptions, and why it matters. So thank you for speaking to me.
Well, thanks for having me.
And let me ask you to begin with, since I just mentioned you're in departments of microbiology, immunology, I also know that you're the director of the curriculum in toxicology. So how do you identify as a scientist? Are you a microbiologist? Are you a pediatrician? Are you a toxicologist? Tell me something about your background.
Maybe, maybe a scientist with multiple personality disorder. I think I probably identify most with being an inhalation toxicologist. That's really sort of where I think everything that I do sort of converges, whether I take it from the environmental aspect or more from the pediatric aspect or more from the microbiology aspect. What all comes together is I'll deal in the lung. I'm not going to go with any other organs, and anything that is inhaled is something that I'm interested in, how it actually modifies the respiratory tract.
And what got you started down this path? Because it probably wasn't e-cigarettes. They're such a modern phenomenon. So why do you care about this subject? What drew you to it?
Yeah, so I've been studying the effects of cigarette smoke probably for, probably for a good 15, 18 years now. And there's a lot of good science that actually went into cigarette smoke, and we published some really cool papers and really cool studies on it. But it became apparent that smoking is sort of like on a decline, which is great. And then all of a sudden these e-cigarettes came and were the new kid on the block, and we had to sort of shift gears a little bit, but because we had a lot of the knowledge already from cigarette smoke, we just added e-cigarettes as another layer of what we already did.
So I've always wondered this about cigarettes, that we hear about all these chemicals, and I suppose some of the chemicals are natural to the tobacco plant, and that's how they end up there. But I've always had this understanding that there are a lot of added chemicals. So can you tell me something about cigarettes first, traditional cigarettes, about what's in them and what's bad? Is nicotine itself a problem? I mean, I guess the thing I've always wondered is, if they didn't add any of that stuff, how much less toxic would a cigarette be?
Well, I think so. So there's actually what's called a reference cigarette, which actually has very little beyond the tobacco, the paper, the filter, but it has a standardized amount of nicotine and a standardized amount of tobacco in it. But it actually doesn't have some of the other components that actually make cigarettes much more palatable. And no smoker would be caught dead smoking these things. They're apparently really disgusting. So in addition to having the sort of plant-based tobacco product in cigarettes, there's also other things in there that make it a little bit more palatable. So there are some flavorings in there. There are some sort of products in there like propylene glycol that actually make it a little bit more moist. So there are some other chemicals in there that make the product that we have today.
But somehow the idea of smoking cigarettes got started when it must have just been the plant, really, right?
Correct.
So it was palatable enough to start this public health issue.
Right. Well, I mean, nicotine is probably one of the strongest addictive chemicals we know. And that comes with a tobacco plant. So you will inhale the nicotine and it will make you addicted to the sort of habit to the cigarettes, because nicotine is highly, highly addictive. And that comes with the tobacco plant. There's nothing we can do about that.
So e-cigarettes, is it presumably they were created to be a lesser of two evils? Are they? Is it naive to think that that was their origin? And are they actually the lesser of two evils?
So this is a question I have been asked, oh gosh, I don't know how many times in the past 7 years or so. Are e-cigarettes safer than cigarettes, or are they the lesser evil of these two evils? And I always say it's like we don't know, because it took us decades to actually identify what cigarettes do, what kind of long-term health effects cigarettes cause. It took us literally decades to do that. If you go back to the historical timeline, we have less than 10 years in right now. Really, if you look at when Juul and when this really took off, we really have about 10 years, maybe a decade of active e-cigarette usage in the US. So we don't know yet what it's going to be causing long term. We have no idea. So saying it's safer, no, I'm not going to go down that route. But what I do feel very strongly about, are they safe? And that's something that I think all of the data that we've generated and all my colleagues have generated, they are not without health effects, period. That I think is very clear.
If we have about 10 years of use, but we must have even fewer years than that in terms of how long they've been researched.
Yeah, well, I mean, we were some of the first. We started in 2013, so 7 years. And that's when we started. So
Right.
The first publication that we actually published on this was in 2016. And we were one of the first.
And so we know the one thing they're not ever going to remove is nicotine. So nicotine is the addictive component,
Yeah.
but is nicotine, besides causing addiction, is it toxic in other ways? Is nicotine itself toxic?
So that's a really interesting question. That's really being debated. So neurologically, yes. Neurodevelopmentally, yes. There are definitely data out there that show that nicotine causes neurodevelopmental issues, especially in the developing brain. So if you start using nicotine as a 14, 15-year-old, there's definitely neurodevelopmental issues. Cardiovascularly, there's definitely data out there showing that nicotine causes adverse cardiovascular events. In the lung, it may be less clear. I'm not going to say there are or not. There are actually some transgenerational studies where it shows that nicotine alone in utero, so in moms that are pregnant, in the offspring, cause changes in the lung. So there may be sort of transgenerational effects of nicotine on the lung. Again, it's not without effects. Whether it causes heart disease or neurodevelopmentally, those are two bad options.
Yeah, and could you give us, what are e-cigarettes? Could you give us a definition that you like, a functional definition for e-cigarettes?
E-cigarettes are basically devices that use a thermal or a heat-derived aerosolization process to generate an aerosol that can be inhaled. Because the problem is with e-cigarettes, and that's what makes it so challenging in studying, there's so many different devices out there. There's so many different flavors out there. And it constantly changes. The Puffet is now the newest one out there. So what is an e-cigarette? It's you basically have to go back to what it does, not actually what it is. So it basically causes this sort of aerosolization of a liquid that can then be inhaled.
The majority of your presentation focused on these other additives, in particular the flavorings, and so is that's been the focus of much research? Why is it those chemicals in particular that have become the focus?
I just was fascinated by the chemical structure, and it goes back to being an inhalation toxicologist. When I looked at the structure of cinnamaldehyde, it's basically benzene and acrolein, which we know are really, really bad actors, having a love child and making cinnamaldehyde. That's basically what it is. Cinnamaldehyde has the benzene ring and the acrolein, and they're basically just fused together. So when we looked at the structure, we just knew this was going to be highly toxic. And so from there, we actually looked at sort of, quote unquote, sister chemicals or flavoring chemicals that are in the same category, and looked at whether they have similar effects on some of the endpoints we studied. So we really sort of were in the initial class of these aldehydes, but since then there's many studies out there looking much more broadly on flavoring chemicals and the toxicity, including some other chemical classes that are also potentially toxic. But I think the reason why we sort of honed in on the flavorings is because that was something unique to e-cigarettes. You're not going to find cinnamaldehyde in cigarettes. You're not going to find benzaldehyde in cigarettes. So those were unique components that are in e-cigarettes. And we also thought that that's maybe something that we can regulate. Maybe we're not going to get nicotine out of e-cigarettes. Maybe we're not going to get e-cigarettes off the market. But by showing the toxicity of these defined flavoring chemicals, we also thought by sort of publishing very rigorous research on the toxicity of these flavorings, maybe we can have an impact on the regulation of flavorings.
It's remarkable, this idea that maybe we could get regulation. I would think most people would assume that we have protections, and that surely from the beginning these would have been regulated by the FDA. And to hear they're not, and especially when you said they were defined not as a drug delivery device, but as a nicotine inhaler. So nicotine's a drug, inhaler seems like a delivery method. How is a nicotine inhaler not a drug delivery device?
Right, so the problem there was that the FDA has different sort of jurisdictions. They have one which was the devices, and then with the 2009 law of the Family Prevention Tobacco Control Act, they also had the Center for Tobacco Products, and that basically controlled all tobacco products. So depending on which category you went in, that's where you're basically regulated. But you can sort of play the system and say, no, I'm not this, I'm really more this, and it's like this creates this little bit of a ping pong back and forth. And that was probably one of the initial problems.
I have a question from our chat from Kathy Clabby. She asked, what specific regulation of the e-cigarette or vaping industry do you think is most urgently needed?
Flavors. Take them out. Take them out. Leave the nicotine in, basically make it nicotine and the humectants. Leave that in. Take all the flavors out. All flavors, including menthol, including tobacco flavors, all flavors.
Have there been attempts towards that and pushback by the industry?
Yes, yes. I'm also part of the Tobacco Action Committee of the American Thoracic Society, which is the biggest U.S. sort of association of pulmonologists, and we certainly have written letters to the FDA with references supporting our statements to get all the flavorings out. Even if it's not all flavorings, take out some that we know are highly, highly toxic. Cinnamaldehyde should not be found in anything. Diacetyl should not be found in any kind of product. We know they're toxic. We know they cause really, really bad health effects. So they should be removed in all products.
So it's not easy to get that. So it's that well known and established that these are dangerous chemicals, and yet they can be found in products like this that are sold to the public.
Yep. Well, we don't know. That's the problem. We don't know what's in them. So is there cinnamaldehyde in any of the products? We don't know. Is there a diacetyl in any of the products? We don't know, because there's not, like when you go shopping to the grocery store, you pick up most any kind of food item and you can look on the back and see what's in there, the ingredient list. It's part of a law that was passed, but that we basically have to know what is in any kind of food product. So that was part of the ruling that was supposed to go into effect in May of 2018. That any kind of e-cigarettes that's out on the market, then the consumer can make the decision, do I want to vape this product that has cinnamaldehyde in there or not? So basically every company and every product would have had to have this ingredient list. That was supposed to have been going into effect in May of 2018, and that was kicked back down to May of 2022. And after the FDA was sued by the American Academy of Pediatrics, it now was pulled back to May of 2020. So in May of 2020, all of these products will actually have to file for approval with the FDA. But with COVID, that is now actually in limbo because they're saying we can't really do this. So they're continuing to be on the market actually illegally.
And even though researchers like you have been concerned about these products for 7 years, it's really only been since June of 2019. It's only been since this last year that a known outbreak of vaping related illness has. So, I mean, can you tell me something about what that is? And has that had any effect on the chance of regulation?
So interesting. So we thought that this outbreak, as sad and as tragic as it is for the people affected by it, would finally change the mind of politicians and regulators to actually put some real teeth into regulation, especially when it comes to these flavoring chemicals. So that's when on September 11th, when the Trump administration said we're going to basically implement a flavor ban, we were all happy. But so what the problem here is that the outbreak of these vaping associated lung injuries were maybe not caused by Juul. They're probably caused by these bootlegged THC cartridges that may have been laced with something that we don't know what it was. So they may have not been actually nicotine product or nicotine e-cigarettes. There may have been other vaping products. So that sort of muddled the messaging a little bit. And all of the vaping, the pro-vaping lobby basically said, wait a minute, why are you regulating my e-cigarettes? This is a THC problem. This is not a nicotine e-cigarette problem. And they were very, very vocal about not basically regulating it, to the point where they actually launched advertisement in certain regions for certain days of the year with people saying, we vape, we vote. So this becomes a really, really big political issue now.
One of the common defenses of vaping products is that it helps people quit smoking. So you showed at least one slide that amongst high school students, vaping products are very popular, but smoking regular cigarettes is actually down. So is that, what's your response to that idea that, hey, it's, again, lesser of two evils, because does it increase smoking? So does it decrease smoking use?
Right. So if you really go back in both the sort of general US population as well as more the sort of under 25-year-olds, the smoking rate has been declining constantly in the United States, even before e-cigarettes came on the market. And we're just on the same trajectory now that we've been on for a good 2 decades now, I believe. And it's now like 14% nationwide. And cigarettes are really, really poo-pooed among teenagers. Most teenagers, when you smoke, you're sort of like it's not really very classy. It's not very accepted. It's sort of more by fringe groups that do that. And largely because of tobacco-free kids, because of a lot of these campaigns that have done a really, really good job in sort of showing the potential consequences of smoking, the health effects of smoking. So those campaigns, the tobacco-free kids campaigns and other campaigns, really have done a great job in reducing smoking rates in the United States, probably more so than e-cigarettes would have. So, but in teenagers, there was no smoking problem to basically have a cessation product, because not enough teenagers smoke to actually get off cigarettes. So in teenagers, it's the opposite. They basically are much more likely to be initiated to be tobacco and nicotine users now, rather than the cessation argument.
We're going to have to wrap up pretty soon, but we have some questions from the chat that I'd like to get to, and maybe one or two other questions I have. One, Now, here's a technical question that I don't understand. So, is there any relationship between the polymorphism of CYP? Could you explain the question before you answer it?
The CYPs are the metabolizing enzymes that metabolize. There's a big class of enzymes that are really the sort of biggest class of compounds in the body that metabolize any kind of chemical, both foreign as well as endogenous, made by the body. And these CYP enzymes, the CYP2A6 is the enzyme that metabolize or breaks down nicotine in its form of cotinine, which becomes excreted. So the question here is, there are known polymorphisms of these CYP enzymes that make some people what's called low metabolizers versus fast metabolizers. And we have not looked in the low versus fast metabolizer in terms of the nicotine metabolism. But what this does, it sort of mimics what you would find in the low metabolizer polymorphism group.
And
so
I want to thank
hope that answers the question.
Barbara Shane for that question. And you mentioned that amongst the effects of some of these added flavor chemicals, that they affect the way we process nicotine?
Yes. So, right. So the flavoring chemicals that we sort of focused on, the cinnamaldehyde, the benzaldehyde, and all of those, they basically completely block that enzyme. So it makes it impossible for that enzyme to metabolize nicotine in its excretable form of cotinine. What that would mean in the body is that nicotine has a longer half-life. It lingers around a lot longer and does not get metabolized or detoxified to its cotinine, which then gets excreted.
I have a question from Betty Sue Masters. Do you feel that your outreach activities are having an impact on the use of e-cigarettes, and considering the amount of lobbying that's done by the industry? Having seen the backlash against cigarettes, do you foresee the eventual banning of e-cigarettes?
I'm not foreseeing the banning of e-cigarettes. I just hope they would be more regular. I just, baby steps. I just want them to be regulated. So we don't have products on the market like these puff bars where we have no idea where they are coming from and what is contained in them. That is just wild to me. So I just want them to be regulated. And in terms of, do my outreach activities have an impact? What I want these teenagers to do is make informed decisions. They're really smart. We have to understand teenagers have all of their information on their iPhone at all times, and they fact check you in real time. So you cannot BS them and basically with hyperbole and tell them things that are not true, because you get caught immediately. But by telling them things like bringing them to the lab and showing them what these things do, and showing them, again, this really goes back to Dana Hain and Elise Hickman, basically putting science into a way that they can understand, into digestible chunks, that provides them with knowledge and with power. And then they tell other friends that this is what it is. To give you an example, I gave this very similar talk, Teen Science Cafe. So this was mostly attended by teenagers in the Chapel Hill, Durham sort of area, including my daughter, who basically just rolls her eyes whenever I talk. She's just so sick and tired of me talking about e-cigarettes. But what she was able to get from it was the misconception of vapor versus aerosol. That for some reason stuck in her head. And she knows when she thinks of an aerosol, she thinks of anything chemical, anything that needs to be regulated, anything that is potentially harmful. And that stuck to her. She's like, now I understand the difference between a vapor and an aerosol, and this is an aerosol. It's
Whereas,
bizarre.
as you said, you mentioned that vapor is simply the gaseous form of a liquid like water but
this is a mixture. And so I never know what sticks, what sort of reaches them. Having them come to the lab clearly had an effect on them because they went out and told their friends about it. telling, the difference between vapor and aerosol clearly has an effect. So I never know, sort of a trial and error sort of, process here. But even if I only reach 2 or 3 teenagers who are not starting to vape, or who will potentially quit vaping, or even more importantly, who tell 2 or 3 other friends of theirs to stop vaping, I have had more impact than any of my published papers combined.
I have a question from Stefan Frank. Are there any studies out about the risk of secondhand inhalation of e-cigarette aerosols?
That's an excellent, excellent question, and that's something that I think is under really intense investigation right now for a number of different reasons. Let me tell you one. So one is these e-cig aerosols will eventually deposit on any kind of surface. So the secondhand exposure may not actually be through the inhalation route, but through the oral route, which is really dangerous if you have toddlers or smaller kids around, because again, nicotine is a poison. So the secondhand exposure may not necessarily be inhalation, because the aerosol actually drops. I think a lot of us now have seen the sort of 3D simulation of COVID-19 aerosols. The same thing is true here. Aerosol science is the same thing. It doesn't matter whether you exhale, whether you cough the COVID-19 particles, or whether you exhale an e-cigarette cloud. The same sort of dynamic, aerosol dynamic apply here. So it may not be an inhalational route, it may actually be something else on surfaces. But the other thing that I think we need to also consider, just because SARS-CoV, COVID-19 is on everyone's mind. Do exhaled e-cig aerosols become a carriage or a package for COVID-19? So what I mean by that, we all know that coughing is a really efficient way of distributing SARS-CoV particles into the atmosphere, and basically a great route of infection for everyone else. But now you have potentially, does the particle actually carry the virus? Does the aerosol particle from your e-cigarette potentially carry the virus, and becomes actually a packaging system that can be delivered even further? So that's something that I think is of great interest to people.
Interesting. I have a question from Ken Lido, who says, what about pipe smoking? How does it compare with cigarette smoking and vaping?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know enough about pipe smoking. I think pipe smoking is much more pure. I know there's obviously some pipe tobacco that is enhanced with like some flavorings like vanilla. But pipe smoking, I don't know whether it actually is like a deep inhalation, or whether it's just a sort of oral nasal inhalation that gets exhaled. I really don't know much about pipe smoking. Sorry.
And I have one maybe final question, and we'll wrap up unless anyone has one last chance to send in any questions. What about nicotine chewing gum? So similar to vaping, it's, supposed to be a smoking cessation tool. What do we know about the effects of that? Does it help with smoking cessation? And what about the toxic effects of nicotine in that form?
So nicotine chewing gum is one of the traditional NRTs, nicotine replacement therapies, like Nicorette and things like that. So you may have seen some of the commercials now with these little pouches that people put under their tongue, which are slow release nicotine delivery methods. So that is being used as a nicotine replacement therapy. I don't know what nicotine by itself, the effects of it on the oral mucosa, I don't know. But it's certainly approved. And I do also know that some teenagers are using them now because they're so highly addicted to nicotine, because if they can't vape or use their e-cigarettes in class, they actually are chewing nicotine gum.
So thank you very much for your time. And I want to thank everyone. Let me just give you a chance to give us a final message. What do you want us to know? You've told us a lot about the history of e-cigarettes and vaping, and about what the research now shows. What do you want us to know?
I really just want people to make informed decisions, and take vaping out of politics. This is not a political issue. This is really more a scientific issue that should be resolved on the science and the regulatory bodies here. Don't make it into politics. Stop doing the we vape, we vote. Stop taking, vaping out of politics, period.
Excellent. Dr. Ilona Jaspers, thank you very much.